Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our Employment Data Task Force meeting today. My name is Sydney Armendariz, and I am the Chief of Strategic Initiatives and Partnerships here at C2C. And I am filling in for our Executive Director, Marianne Bates, who is out this week. So I will be your host for today's meeting. So first, to just explain today's process for this meeting, task force members, whenever possible, please unmute yourself and speak your comments. If you type a comment into chat, we will pause periodically to read the chat comments out loud, but we definitely encourage our task force members to go ahead and unmute so we can make sure that we hear your comments. And for our community members, you are invited to submit public comment in advance of these meetings to C2C directly. And the email address is on this slide. It's info@c2c.ca.gov. You can also make comments via chat during the meeting. And of course, I'm sure none of us are new to Zoom, so we do ask that you keep yourselves muted if you're not speaking, just to reduce background noise. And just another note, our team will be renaming all of the task force members with an A and a colon, just to allow us to more easily identify input from our task force members. So if you see an A in front of your name, don't worry, we're not renaming you personally. We're just making sure that you pop up first on our participant list. So next slide, please. So the goals for today's meeting, first, we're going to review the proposed methodologies, and then we'll review the recommendations on testing. And then we'll end with clarifying some next steps for the definitions. And of course, many thanks to our task force members for providing detailed comments on the methodologies and recommendations. As always, we appreciate your feedback and your dedication to this work. So thank you so much. And with that, I will turn it over to today's facilitator, Kathy Booth from West Ed. We've asked Kathy to continue facilitating these meetings because she, of course, has the institutional and background knowledge of this work. So we thought it was best to make sure that we have her expertise on deck. So she'll go ahead and facilitate today's meeting. So I'll pass it over to Kathy.
Thank you so much, Sydney. Okay, so this is our final meeting of the Employment Data Task Force. So what we're going to be doing today is really firming up those proposed data definitions. And so as you may recall, actually, I'm going to go back up the slide. During the planning process, there was a pretty rigorous way that we came up with the data points that were going to be in the data system, basically by looking at all the possible research questions that people would want to have answered, and then what data points were required, and then review of how those data points are currently processed by each of the data providers. So we knew what the list of data points were, but we were dealing with this issue that each of the education segments tended to process the underlying data set quite slightly differently. So what we did is we took a whole bunch of input from both what we got from the data providers originally, and then what we've had from the earlier two meetings to come up with some possible approaches for a methodology that would be used just by Cradle-to-Career. No one else is obligated to use this methodology. We also looked at issues of testing because we're going to have some new ways of constructing things. It's going to be important to look at validating the approach. And those are some of the things that we had a homework assignment about, that members of the task force were looking at possible ways to process information or ways to do testing. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. So at the last meeting, we came up with two guidelines for the methodology decisions, because in truth, there's no one right way to calculate a number of these metrics. And in fact, the way that we may be coming up with for the purpose of public-facing tools like the dashboard or the query builder for Cradle-to-Career may not be the appropriate methodology that you might use in a different context. So a good example is if you're trying to document things using educational institutions as your base, saying we want to start with all students who are enrolled in one place and see what happens to them over time. That's a really different frame than what we're doing in Cradle-to-Career, which is we're taking each individual human being and we're following them over time, where it's their arc related to earnings that's most important, and they are potentially interacting with a number of different educational institutions in that long journey toward hopefully a living wage, which is what we want to document. Is at what point do people end up earning enough money that they can take care of themselves? So given that truth, for this particular purpose, we want to make sure that the metrics are realistically reflecting the true earnings of each individual, as opposed to someone working full time and what we should sort of expect them to make. Because what we want to do is we're not trying to justify particular programs or interventions. We're just trying to understand what happens to people across all the possible things that could happen to them. And finally, we should be eliminating records that don't appear to accurately reflect individual earnings. So as you may recall at the last meeting, we had EDD graciously do some pretty extensive analyses that let us look at issues of concern that members of the task force had generated about the validity of various data points. So that's what's going to be shaping our discussion today. All right, so for the first homework assignment that we're looking at, it's this issue of the proposed methodologies for several things. One is data cleanup, the second is cohorts, the third is annual earnings, the fourth is earnings gains, and the fifth is living wage attainment. So what I've done is I've consolidated both the original proposal that was put forward based on our earlier discussions and then the input that we received from task force members. I want to emphasize that getting to see all of your input all at once, which was really coming in until pretty late at night yesterday. I want to give us time to really sit and look at the proposed methodologies all together, because now that you've maybe seen some of the input, you might have some additional ideas. So I'm going to pause for a little bit and make sure that everyone really has a chance to be grounded. All right. So let's start with data cleanup. So this one was very easy because there was general agreement about the proposal. So based on the analysis that EDD did, we basically proposed that we would eliminate records for individuals with 20 or more employers. And you're seeing there the proportion of UI records for which that was the case over a 20-year time span. So it's not a lot of people, but it still is important to get it right. And the second thing is that C2C would eliminate records for people that have exact duplicates that say, oh, they worked for the same employer and they made exactly the same amount of money twice in the same fiscal quarter, which would imply some sort of data entry error. And again, that's a very, very small number of records, but still not insignificant. So all the feedback we got was that people agreed that methodologically this would make the data stronger. And there was one question that was raised, which was about null records. So I just want to remind the group that EDD did not find null records in recent history. And that basically if a record is missing, that means that there's no earnings reported in that quarter. So we had agreed previously we're going to treat that as a 0. Any questions or thoughts now that you're looking at this all on one slide? Does anyone have any concerns about this recommendation? Okay, all right. So let's go on to cohorts. Now, this is going to be a really important issue for us to get level set on, because there is some disagreement in the group about this approach. So the cohort is once we've matched all the records and we're saying whose data are going to be represented as we look at things like earnings and earnings gains and living wage attainment. So one of the ideas that came out of our last meeting, Mikhail Kurlander said, well, why don't we have multiple cohorts rather than try to get just one? Because if you imagine a scenario, there's the query builder, where somebody who's reasonably data savvy could go in and say, oh, I've got this question, so I'm going to pull these various variables and I'm going to combine them to create a summary table that gives me an answer to my question. And that's why we've got 4 different versions that are addressing 2 different concepts. So the first is the most generous, that we would basically have all matched individuals. So if the student has a valid SSN and they can be found in the UI file, then we're going to go ahead and look at it. And that person may have only 1 record in a fiscal year, meaning that they may have left the state, they may be only marginally employed, but we still want to see their outcomes, because there might be a reason that we want to understand what's going on for people that are in whatever their outcome. The second cohort would be all exiting graduates. So there's 2 things in here that are really important. One is the idea that the person is no longer enrolled in any form of post-secondary. This gives us a pure sense of where they are related to earnings when they've finished their education, at least for the moment. So again, from that original group, every student with a valid SSN that can be found, And then we are also saying that they have had to have earned some sort of academic award, like a certificate or a degree. And that's a common construction that's used when looking at outcomes. So those are the first two. The second two are going to be very similar. So one is all exiting students with stable employment, and then all exiting graduates with stable employment. And in this one, we're looking at the idea that we're looking for 3 consecutive quarters of UI data, meaning that they are sort of securely attached to the labor market. And they're going to probably be somewhat different than others. We also know this is the majority of people that can be found in the UI data set based on the analysis that EDD did. And we're taking the approach that CSU uses, where we're looking into prior and following years, so that those 3 quarters don't have to fit within any particular like academic year in order to be, or a calendar year. So we're really looking for a sense that they really were stably employed in that time period. So that is what the proposal is. Are there any questions about what it is methodologically before we look at your input? Okay. So the first bit of input that came from many different task force members is that it is very important to ensure that those individuals have actually exited all post-secondary when you're doing a lot of these analyses. The other thing that was important is that there's a realization that there's no one data set that gives us all the information about whether students were still enrolled in some sort of education. So there was a recommendation that we be matching to a national source, such as the National Student Clearinghouse, but also that we're matching against other data providers within the state. Because one of the things we know is that you can opt out as an individual from the clearinghouse, which means that the records may not be as complete as a file that, for example, we could get from UC. So are there any thoughts about that issue about exiters? And do you agree with this approach?
I agree that yeah, using both the national and whatever internal data we have would be probably optimal for figuring out who's exited. So I agree with that.
Any other thoughts? Oh,
Just one other thought, that you have to do this whenever you refresh the data because status changes.
Yeah. Any other thoughts?
I guess I'll just say that I think we have to recognize that no matter how hard we try on this, it won't be perfect, because somebody may look like they've exited now, as I think Jeff just said, or maybe that was Richard. I didn't see who was talking. That somebody maybe not enrolled now, but then next quarter we get the data and they're enrolled again, and we thought they were an exiter, but now they've returned. And so even if we had perfect data, these are not hard and fast categories. I'm okay with there being some not fully out people in our, we think, exited groups, but I think we don't really have a choice.
Okay. So let's move on to the next bullet. So this was a really interesting thought related to that idea of, we were really clear when we were looking backwards, like, so they've exited for now. But Rick made a really important point that if you go on and you earn supplemental awards from like certificate to associate's degree, or bachelor's degree to community college certificate, or bachelor's degree to graduate degree, it changes the outcome. And so one of the questions I wanted to raise for the group is, do we need to have some more slices to the cohort related to ongoing attainment of awards over time? Because remember, this is set such that you can set the time frame. So you can say, okay, I want to see everybody who exited in 2020, and then I want to follow them for the next, 10 10 years and see where they're at each year. That there's some really interesting labor market analyses that I've seen where you're watching that longer curve, especially for some disciplines. You don't see a lot of earnings gains in the first year or two, but then you see that number go way up over time. So do you think that we have to have another slice, and how would we slice people related to ongoing education?
Go ahead, Rick.
Okay, I feel very strongly about this. In our wrestling with this over the decades, we've really found, we call them tracks or paths, but you want to have a set of paths that you can put 100% of the exiters into, and that represent, in a sense, a treatment. Because what we're always trying to do is evaluate some kind of treatment. And the worst thing you can do, in my view, is mix dropouts and graduates together, because then you don't know what you have. And of course, as pointed out already, status changes over time. But for any point of time that you're measuring, you've got to get people into the right treatment groups. And so there's drops, there's completes. I submitted the 6 groups that we're using. When you consider the community colleges, there are more. Students who got an AA and didn't go on, students who got an AA and did go on, etc. But without that, you generate a lot of nonsense in the data. And I see that separate from calculating earnings. You've got to have a clear set of treatment buckets.
Brianna?
Yeah, I agree with Richard's point about including if they have a graduate degree or not. We do that with our dashboards. It does show real big differences, especially between disciplines and that kind of thing on earnings. I think that's something that people should know, that if they're going to this institution, it might not just mean going to that institution as an undergraduate. It might mean going on to get a graduate degree to achieve that salary level. We use kind of a bunch of splits. We have non-completers versus completers in our earnings. And then we also have completed a bachelor's degree only and went on to get a graduate degree. And then we differentiate what graduate degree within there. So like if they get an MBA or a PhD and that kind of thing. Now, obviously there are issues with the NSC data. You can get some of that from the NSC data, but if we have multiple sources, you might be using a similar approach as where we're trying to identify if they're in post-secondary, where you're looking at NSC to get some of that information, and not also cross-checking between UC and CSU data.
Sandra?
So I don't disagree with the comments made earlier. I think that I'm looking at it from the perspective of how do we determine who left our system but then continued, and I'm thinking specifically of programs like teacher preparation, where many times our students don't necessarily complete, but they gather enough credits to transfer to a Cal State or a UC or at a private in order to then complete a bachelor's degree to go into the teaching profession. We don't get credit for that, but the student didn't drop out either, right? And so how do we ensure that that is also something that is accounted for in this space? Because I get that we want to capture credentials, absolutely, but I do know that a large portion of our student population doesn't necessarily get a certificate or degree to transfer. So how do we allow enough space for that to be captured as well?
We have that as one of our pathways. Started here, completed somewhere else.
So I'm thinking about this based on all the other data points that have already been identified. And one is the idea of the highest credential. And we have sort of a hierarchy that got listed of it's really based on duration, how long, the certificate, the associate's degree. bachelor's, master's, professional, PhD, if I'm remembering correctly. So I'm wondering if we have, there's two ways to do this. You could just construct a bunch of cohorts that say, like, let's go back up one. So rather than saying exiting graduates, you could say exiting graduates with a certificate, whose highest award is a certificate, exiting graduates whose highest award is a bachelor's degree, and so on. That would allow us to begin to just slice and dice how much education. It doesn't speak to Sandra's point, but there is something that we could do, because there is the idea of you're a student who transferred. And so you could, in the mix, when you're pulling those variables, say that you wanted to, like, let's say you were trying to understand the teacher preparation programs, say in the state of California, for people who, wait, no, sorry. The reason we can't do that is that we don't know they were in a teacher prep program unless they've completed. We do have declared program of study as a variable that the Community College Chancellor's Office is willing to give, even though it's not pressure tested as much as the completion metric. So you probably could do that. So you could say someone who declared an interest in being in teacher prep did not complete and has a bachelor's degree, did not complete at a community college. I think you could construct that using the variables that are there. So let's go back to this idea of all the cohorts. Would it be valuable to take that exiting graduates cohort and turn it into maybe 6 cohorts based on educational attainment?
I think it's a must do. I like the concept of highest credential achieved. Because other than that, I'll just give one quick example. The Upjohn Institute published this study that compared the earnings of students from the top quintile and the bottom quintile who got bachelor's degrees. And they found a huge difference with the people in the bottom quintile earning a lot less. But once they controlled for going on to graduate school, there was no difference. So if you don't control for that, you don't know what you have.
And I would just add that we have historically in our system underreported completions, because historically our system was set up to place the burden on a student to then file a piece of paper, right? To that, and the fact is that they had the credits, they obviously transferred, right? But there is no credential registered within our system because they didn't file that piece of paper. And so it appears as though the student, separated from our system without actually completing anything when it's actually not true.
Brianna?
Yes, I'm just wondering, when you say 6 cohorts, what the value added for doing 6 cohorts is versus adding a flag that says whatever the highest credential is, or maybe I'm just but I guess, is there a difference? Because one would be like a filter in a Tableau dashboard, and the other one is like creating groups on our end, I guess, by this differentiation. I'm just wondering what you're thinking there in terms of thinking about cohorts versus just a flag.
So what I'm thinking about is the operationalizing the drag and drop functionality. So here I am, I've got my question. I want to know about teacher prep programs for outcomes for students that completed an associate's degree or not, and ultimately got the bachelor's degree. So I'm going to have to pull things from it. We don't have the query builder tool yet that will have to be purchased or built or something. So it's hard to know exactly what that structure is going to be like. So we don't have to worry so much about getting it right. We can basically say the concept is that you would be able to search based on being a graduate who exited and also the highest educational attainment level. And we can let the data scientists figure out how that actually gets manually built into or already is a feature of some sort of tool.
Thanks.
I think also because this tool is going to be open to the general public, in my experience with developing these, you want to shortstop obvious mistakes people will make. And I think one of the most obvious ones here is including in your groups people who do not belong together, like dropouts and graduates. And so, in structuring the tool, you can force people to choose a cohort early on to analyze to prevent these mistakes. And that's what I would like to see built in.
So are there any other thoughts then? So if we figure out a way to combine graduation with highest educational attainment, are there any other thoughts about that idea? Okay, so then our final one is this idea of whether it's really valuable to do the 3 consecutive quarters for stable employment, or to be just say, can we reasonably believe they can be found in the data set? So I don't know, I'm gonna actually reach out to Jill Lufkin from the Chancellor's office. So my memory from early launch board iterations is that there were a lot of community college students that had very spotty employment records. So as you're thinking about what this means for a population that might be more likely to be marginally employed, what do you think would be valuable to understand community college student outcomes?
Yeah, thanks, Kathy. And I remember, and I was trying to remember the name of the effect that has been documented about earnings drop-offs for community college students prior to enrollment. I'm sure if you remember what that is, but there is like documented studies.
Ashenfelder dip.
Thank you. Yeah, so, I think that is a good question, because we want to be sure we're including people who can be found in the labor market. But what is a reasonable number of quarters to assume that people are there? And I think Rick proposed that like 2 out of 4 or something like that it could be more reasonable for folks. So yes, we don't want to, and my note in the document was we don't want to, for some folks, especially related to, these are cohorts, sorry, that's a different discussion. I'm talking about the cohorts piece, but I think, yeah, it is interesting because folks maybe have a little bit less. And I think the question here too pertains a little bit to the other measures, which is that when we're looking at earnings, when we're thinking about pre-earnings and also post-earnings, like do the same constructs apply? Like, do you need to be found in 3 consecutive quarters if you're looking at change in earnings? And I sort of like pose that maybe to the group if we're thinking about just earnings after, or also just in pre and post earnings in this instance.
Jeff.
Yeah, can you remind me of the logic of why you want to do stable employment? Because my big question in the back of my head is the economy is not always stable, and you go through periods of time where the noise truly reflects the underlying phenomenon, like a recession. And so you're going to lose a lot by having if you censor out people who aren't stable, right? And so that's my big fear here.
I will second a concern with the phrase stable employment, because it's like we're only going to look at winners. We've always used the term found in the California labor market. And then the debate is, what are the patterns that represent being in the labor market? And so I added in my notes, I don't think you need 3 consecutive quarters. If you're there in the first quarter and the fourth quarter of a follow-up year, I think it's reasonable to assume that you're in the California labor market. Conversely, if you're found in the first 3 quarters and then never appear again, you probably left the state during that year. So it's really the patterns more than a simple 2 quarters, 3 quarters that I think we have to be concerned with. And the idea that we're only going to measure people with stable employment, I think is bad for PR purposes as well.
Brianna.
Yeah, I mean, I think that 3 quarters is a nice compromise because there are arguments to be made to, like, you know, only use people that have 4 quarters because that represents one thing. And then I can also see the issue of, you know, wanting to communicate that maybe you won't have stable employment. You know, maybe you will only be employed 2 quarters for whatever reason. So I don't know. I think 3 quarters is a nice balance because the other issue is when they're entering the workforce, right? So, you know, they might be missing a couple of quarters because they enter late within that year or whatever and leave the state. Who knows? I don't know. but there are a lot of reasons why they wouldn't have 4 records, some of which would indicate recession or unstable employment, or it might just be the regular path of their career. So I don't know. I think 3 quarters is a good compromise. And we're going to depress the earnings if we only look at 2 quarters or below.
Sandra.
I just want to echo what Richard said in terms of, you know, reasonably assume that they can be found in the labor market, because you also have to think about our economy as it is now in terms of the amount of gig work that our graduates or completers may get into as they start their careers. You know, it's never stable. So I also question like the definition of stable, like what is stable for them? I mean, it wouldn't be stable for my generation, but for this current generation, it's different. And so are we applying an old standard to a new economy? We really need to keep that in mind. And also just the nature of how young people find employment is very different than it was, you know, 10, 20 years ago. And so I just want us to be sensitive to that and think about also, you know, entrepreneurs and the gig economy and all those Uber drivers who in their mind, that's stable work, right? But we're not capturing it that way in our system. And so I just want to make sure that we are cognizant of that.
Jeff.
Just so I understand how this methodology works and the time frame that you're looking at it within. We had a recent hire. She worked for Census in 2010, took 6 years off for maternity issues, and then re-entered the labor market full time. How does that person enter into your data if you picked them up at the beginning of your study with just say 2 quarters and then they leave for maternity? And do you pick them up when they come back in? Because they left the California labor market. They didn't leave the state, but they did eventually re-enter. So how do cases like that get dealt with, and do you care?
So let me speculate on this. So let's say I'm in the Career Builder and I'm like, okay, so I want to see everybody who exited CSU in this particular year, and I want to see their earnings year, like I'm going to look at you know, biology majors, and I want to follow their earnings year over year. And so if the person was in the labor market originally and then left for maternity leave, they're going to disappear out of that cohort, and then they'll come back in at a later point as soon as they have 3 consecutive terms of employment. So it really depends on where you're setting the point where you're looking. So if it's when she's on maternity leave, she's not going to be there. But if it's when she goes back in, then she's going to be there again. So I think that's operationally how that would function. Does that change how you think about it?
No, it was a big, mostly a question. I was just trying to, it helped me understand the framework of how you're using this 3 quarters, because I think you need to just to be thinking about that, right? And I think you answered it well. Thank you.
Brianna.
Yeah, I just want to make sure that we're not like confounding this, you know, this idea. So I can understand concerns about like stable employment and getting credit for stable employment if you only have 1 or 2 quarters listed. But my understanding is that this metric is not, we're not going to be quoting what percentage are stably employed. What this metric is doing is saying of those that we're calling stably employed, these are their earnings. Is that correct?
Correct.
So I think that, you know, for community colleges, this would actually work against you if you are using fewer quarters to identify who's stably employed, because their earnings would be less because they would only have one or two, because we're doing like a simple sum, right? They would only have quarter earnings in 1 or 2 quarters. So that would be less than, for example, somebody that has 3 quarters of data for earnings.
Rick.
So are we saying stable employment is an outcome and we're going to count the percent of people who have stable employment?
No, we're saying among people who have 3 contiguous terms of employment, something else. So that would be like, if you're trying to say, I want to understand the difference between how much money a Black woman in STEM makes compared to a white man, and you want to make sure that you're looking at people that appear to really be employed, although we don't know what they're employed in, then you have an apples to apples comparison.
Because I think this goes to the larger issue of having multiple measures of earnings. And, you know, I said in my comments, the problems we have found with that. But I think if we're going to have multiple measures of earnings, we have to frame it that way, that we measured earnings different ways. Because is there a measure of unstable employment, which is what this suggests? Are we going to declare some people with 1 quarter to be found and take their measure? My experience is, you know, multiple measures of earnings is a path you don't want to go down. But is that what stable employment means? That we have a median earnings that's based on a subgroup, based on their pattern of earnings versus some other group that has a different pattern of earnings?
Yes. This is a cohort, it's not an outcome.
Okay. I think that's a poor idea.
Jesse.
So to the extent that what Richard's objecting to is the idea that you would have a dashboard that compares the two, that compares the earnings measure for one measure and another, I think that's probably not a direction you want to steer people, because I think this is more different ways of dealing with these technical issues about who's in the sample. But the fact that what we're focusing on is not counting people who are stably employed, but counting earnings for the stably employed, which I think is a useful measure, that makes me prefer the 3 consecutive quarters approach over Richard's suggestion of the 1st and 4th quarters. Because if you just saw somebody in the 1st and 4th quarters and not 2 and 3, probably both 1 and 4 are partial quarters, and they're misleading about the person's employment in those quarters. Whereas with 3 consecutive, you at least know that one of those is pretty likely to be a full quarter, and even if the first and last one may not be. And this, again, just for people who weren't part of the earlier conversation, the issue is we only see whether you were employed at all in a quarter and what your earnings were. We don't know whether you started midway through the quarter or left midway through. So we don't know whether this is capturing earnings for what you would have earned if you worked consistently through that quarter.
Thanks. Akhtar.
Yeah, I just want to mention what we experienced working with various customers like training providers and education institutes when they ask us to match SSNs with the base wage. Some customers or stakeholders, they want us to tell them percentage of the linked record, what percentage have the continuous employment. They use the word, like maybe in stable here, the continuous employed, and sometimes they say only 2 quarters in a row. And some customers say, no, let's do with 4 quarters in a row. So that's our experience working for last 7-8 years. So it varies from customers to customers. Some say 2 quarters in a row, some say 4 quarters in a row. And the term we use is the continuous employment. I just want to mention here.
It's really helpful to know what people are asking you for, because that gives us an idea of what people might be seeking in this case. Jill.
Yeah, and I just wanted to sort of second the language issue with stable employment, because even if you're working in a quarter, doesn't mean you're stably employed in that job. But also a question about how we got here, really, which is I thought we were in, my sense was that we're trying to determine who can be reasonably found in the labor market, and we didn't want to include folks that had exited the labor market. So just as a basis for understanding why we were constructing the cohort, rather than like trying to assume people are stably employed as a concept, but we were trying to find like who is reasonably found in the labor market. So the continuous employment speaks better to that, I think, as a term, but just so we don't conflate that with what we're trying to establish in a dashboard or in a query building tool, that we are operationalizing the concept of stable employment means you have earnings that show up in 3 quarters, which I think is in fact somewhat problematic. So just just to like, these are people we reasonably are sure found in the labor market, which is where I think how we got here.
It's a good reminder.
I'll add a completely different thought that we haven't discussed in case it's useful. When we were studying the employment training panel, we used to count how many quarters people had any earnings after treatment. So, you know, some people were never employed, some people were employed 1 quarter, 2 quarters, 3 quarters, 4 quarters, as far as you want to go. And rather than say stable employment and start manipulating the earnings numbers, it might be useful data to people, as Mohammed has suggested, that were they employed 4 out of 4 quarters, 3 out of 3 quarters, 2 or 1, that's its own variable. Rather than messing with the median earnings by including or excluding more zeros.
Jeff.
Yeah, Richard, I'm wondering the time period you're talking about when you start to talk about quarters, because either these, I forget the term you were using earlier in one of the papers. Are you looking at a calendar year, or are you bound carrying over into the next year when you make that statement to look at someone with 1, 2, 3, or 4 quarters? And so I'm just wondering what your suggestion is there.
We always use event time, so it's since exit. You exit,
yeah,
you roll to the next complete quarter, and you start counting quarters. So it
okay,
could be
thank you.
any amount of time, but it's event based.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
Okay, I want to do a chat vote to figure out where we're at with this. And so what I want to put out there is that we do not have a measure of continuous employment. I'm going to change the term rather than stable, continuous, that we have no distinction in the query builder. Do you agree to say yes if you think that this concept should be eliminated, and type no if you think we should have a stable employment cohort?
Kathy, can you repeat that one more time? I think I got confused with the.
If you're saying yes, that means we're eliminating the stable or continuous employment cohort.
So the question remains, we had this whole discussion about who can reasonably be found in the labor market. If we eliminate that, are we just sort of abandoning that as a concept and saying, like, if you appear, we're any quarter, then you're counted, like, as in the labor market?
Yep.
But I want to change my vote. I thought we were just talking about this, creating a cohort called stably employed. See, we've tangled 2 issues, the outcome and the way to measure earnings. So I'm changing to no, because we don't want to have, because you're changing the definition of earnings. You've tangled a couple issues together here in this.
So I want to clarify, we're not changing the earnings definition. We're just saying among people who have earnings records, we're making a subgroup that says this is for people that have continuous, I'm going to call it continuous employment for 3 years.
I think we're confused over the issue. Are we going to have a definition of found employed? that we will use to calculate a single earnings measure.
Yes, and that is, there's going to be all matched individuals and then all matched exiters based on their educational attainment level.
Okay, but what's the definition of matched? What's the definition of found?
Having a single record in the UI file in the time period.
Okay, well, I'm really against that then, because the stable employment measure is a much more realistic measure than just anybody who earned $1 in 4 quarters as being in the labor market. So,
Okay, I'd like to hear argument from someone who disagrees with Brianna and Rick.
I mean, I don't know the data well enough. I agree with you. It's about the $1, but I just think what do you do in a recession? Are you going to kick all the people out who lose their job and have trouble finding a new job? What are you going to do with the fact that there's 64 million quits in the U.S. economy in 2021 and 74 million hires? There's a lot of people who might just be there for 1 quarter.
We're
and
gonna have
are,
both. We're not
Yep.
saying, so is it just everybody based on 1 quarter or anything? Or is it both that and 3 consecutive? Jesse?
So I don't know that we're going to get to consensus on this, but you said you want to hear the counter argument. So here it goes. I am much less worried about the people leaving California than I am about overstating employment outcomes because there are programs or groups of people who are not stably employed, and we're throwing out the people who aren't stably employed and treating it as if that's not relevant to their outcomes. So my preference is one that counts everybody with $1. I could be, or some looser definition than the 3 stable quarters. As a primary measure, I voted against keeping the other one because I think it's confusing, but I'm not strongly opposed to having a second measure as well. But I do think there's value in the measure that uses everybody as one source of information. I think that's the one I would prefer to use if I could choose between them.
Brianna?
I'm not arguing against myself, but but I just wanted to flag something that the recession comments, Jeff, I think you were making, that I think that's valid. We can see it in our earnings data, just in the depression of earnings in general, but I don't think this tool is going to function as an unemployment calculator. You know what I mean? So like people being out of the workforce because of a recession is not really the way it's going to come up in the data. It's just going to be depressed earnings, which we're going to see anyway in a recession because salaries go down. And we're not going to be able to report on the percent unemployed, right, with this tool.
Correct.
Right, I understand your point there, but the thing is that if you kick somebody out who has what you're going to claim is a spurious earnings point, and it's a true earnings point, you're going to bias upwards your earning results because all you're taking is people who have more than 1 quarter. And I'm going to posit that there truly are people with that quarter, and that's going to reflect on the performance of a program. And I understand you'll pick up that depressed earnings. I get that, but if you move some of them, if I'm understanding correctly, you're moving some of them out and not including them because they have less in earnings than you think is appropriate.
Okay, so Rick, my apologies. We're not going to make it to the rest of the agenda if I don't move us on. So the great thing about this task force is you're advisory to the Office of Cradle-to-Career data. And from this, I think we've got a pretty clear set of considerations for the staff to look at about what it means to have different groups for confusion about what could get lost if you don't have more than one option. And what we'll be doing is writing up sort of the arguments pro and con for you all to review afterwards. And we don't have to get to consensus in this meeting.
Okay, I'll just make one more comment and
Okay.
form the discussion. Here's what I see as 2 alternatives, and I have done both things. One is we use our expertise to come up with the best estimate of annual earnings. And that's what I thought we were talking about. The other way to do it is you want to give the analysts all the options. You say, here's the average earnings for people with 1 quarter, 2 quarters, 3 quarters, or 4 quarters. 4 earnings measures. You choose, the errors you want to accept. I think we have an obligation to come up with a single best estimate of earnings, or else we're not going to be contributing much.
Thank you. Okay. Believe it or not, that was just the cohort. Now we're going to talk about how we're calculating earnings itself. So here, and we've touched on this a little bit, is the idea that there's 2 ways to look at the concept of exiting. One is you just cut it at at July 1 and say, it doesn't matter when you left. We're going to say you left on July 1 if you left during this academic year. And the other is to do it by actual exit date, where you're looking at the fiscal quarter in which they left and then counting from there. There's also the idea of the difference between calculating medians and calculating averages as ways to do it. So what we said is, let's do all 3 options so the user can decide which of these approaches is most useful for them. And then we do have a couple of pieces in here about inflation adjustment and some caps on averages. So let's look at your feedback. So one of the things is that in the clarifications of the document, I had gone back to the documentation of the recommendations adopted by the planning group. And one was the idea that for medians, we're also providing the 25th and the 75th percentile earnings. And a lot of you were very enthusiastic about having those options. The second concern that we've heard already is that having lots of different methodologies is going to generate confusion. So that people are going to say, well, I went to the, Cradle-to-Career and I got this number. Well, I went and got this number. And if the difference is that one picked the median and one picked the average, because most people don't know the difference between those 2 terms, then you've got a problem. Maybe if people using the query builder to generate chaos rather than clarity. And then the final thing is that a number of you said it actually matters what the exit date is. And that when you collapse to academic year, you get problems similar to what we were just discussing about having 1 quarter's worth of data versus 4 quarters worth of data. So with those observations in mind, I want to go back and I'm just going to be totally provocative. What if the only measure was median earnings by exit date? Do you agree with that approach, Jeff?
I put this down. Sort of answer a slightly different question, which is to Richard's point: be responsible and create and present a definition and enable the analyst or someone else to look more deeply. And so, picking one, I think, has a lot of value for the user.
I'll just say median earnings is a must. That's what most economists use. And going with the exit date is also a must to get valid results. So thumbs up to that suggestion.
I agree. If we have to go with one, that's a good one to go with.
Does anyone disagree and think it's better to have the multiple options? Okay. So this is what happens when we were entangling cohort and earnings. I think it gave a lot of clarity for you all about how these things fit together. Great. Oh, the other thing is that people were glad about the inflation adjustment approach that we had suggested. All right, so now we're going to get to earnings gains. So in this case, I'm going to go ahead and say eliminate the top bullet, which was benchmarking against academic year, as Jill raised earlier. Whatever we did for earnings needed to then be applied in this measure as well. So the idea is that we're looking at an immediate period before enrollment, and then we're comparing that to the immediate period after exit using the actual exit quarter. In this analysis, many of you said, this is probably going to be mostly for community college students, because if you go to a 4-year public institution, you're much more likely to be 18 years old and therefore would not have significant earnings prior to that. The second thing that you raised was that this metric should only be calculated for individuals who have both pre and post values. Otherwise, it would distort the numbers. So you'd have to show up in both groups. A third issue that was raised is that it may be valuable to have a threshold for this cohort. So the idea, like, either there has to be a minimum number of quarters of pre-college earnings. Because if you worked a summer job and you had one fiscal quarter that's going to be really different than if you were 35 years old and had a job beforehand and then went to community college, or maybe like an age threshold would be useful. And then finally, the idea that just looking at post-college earnings at 1 year may be too short, because you may see significant increases in earnings in later years. So let's take those one at a time. The first one I'm just going to say is this is a measure that was approved to be in the data set. So the fact that it may be more relevant for some segments more than others is sort of neither here nor there, because this was recommended, but it's a good thing to note. So let's talk about the second idea of that you have to have both pre and post values. Are there any concerns about making that a requirement for this metric?
I would just operationalize it as whatever our definition of found in the labor market is, it has to be applied to the pre-year and post years, and we can do more than 1 year, the same. And you can't be enrolled in the pre-year in education.
Mm-hmm.
So it needs to be pretty, and you're going to get a relatively small population for whom you have pre and post measures.
Is it going to be possible to restrict you can't be enrolled in K-12 in the pre-year? I understand we can do, you can't be enrolled in higher ed because we'll have that, but will we have K-12?
So the issue is that we don't have social security numbers for
Yeah.
K-12 students because it's prohibited by law. So we may
really can't restrict that
retroactively, if they show up in post-secondary and we get their social security number and then they get matched to an earlier point in time because EDD has their record, we can fill in, but it won't be
but we won't be, if we see somebody start at community college this year, we won't have a way of knowing if they were in high school last year. And so we can't do what Rick was suggesting.
No, I'm wrong. No, because you have the records. You'd be able to find their enrollment in K-12 and then find their enrollment in.
And we can link those two together without social. Okay.
How do we count when you talk about pre and post? How do we count for those individuals who come into our system years after they've graduated high school and then now they've realized they need to go back to school? They will have pre-employment data, hopefully, or opportunity youth, who may have been incarcerated. There's so many different factors that impact this metric in terms of pre and post, right? And so we have to perhaps add a qualifier in terms of what is their age at the time that you're calculating it, because otherwise it's gonna, not everyone who comes to us comes right out of high school.
Again, I think we just have to apply the same definition of found in the California labor market and exclude people who are enrolled in education, or else you're just picking up all little bits of part-time work students might do. To go to a deeper sort of understanding of the question here, if we're trying to measure value added, we have found a better measure of value added is comparing dropouts and completers on post measures only from the same program. Because the gap between the dropouts and the completers, in our view, is a better measure of value added than pre-post because of all the problems with the pre-period.
Joe.
Yeah, a couple of things. I like it. The real added value of Cradle-to-Career as a data system is that you can find those folks in K-12 and then therefore exclude them, which I think isn't appropriate for this measure probably. And just the idea that we would only look at so-called dropouts versus completers doesn't work necessarily terribly well for the community college system, because a lot of our students they get a value add from their education, but they may not be the whole skills builders notion. You come in and build a skill, then you go back to getting a job, you get paid more, you get a promotion, may not have obtained a certificate in the course of doing that, and which is why sort of this measure exists in the community college system. So and why this has been used for many years now, just to try and assess some of those gains that folks get, that aren't necessarily captured. And because we serve a population who maybe is more likely to come back after years of employment. So it is really relevant. I think excluding those K-12 enrollments, I know the comments in the document were like, how do you exclude those high school students who are just doing summer work? I think that's a good inclusion to this measure to account for that.
Brianna.
So I'm assuming that this metric is trying to get at some measure of economic mobility. Is that correct?
Yes.
So I think it's a great metric for community colleges. That makes a lot of sense, and maybe even makes some sense for some four-year institutions. But if we are going to include four-year institutions on a metric that's an economic mobility metric, then I think we should consider other ways of doing that, to really give a similar look at what's happening at four-year institutions. So, for example, something that we look at is difference in earnings, or comparing earnings to what parental income is. And that is something for four-year institutions we might have a lot more information on, and include a lot more students in those calculations. So I'll just kind of put that out there. It might make it sticky and difficult, but if we're talking about an economic mobility metric, that is also that four-year institutions could also benefit from, we might want to differentiate the way we're doing that for each group.
That's a really interesting proposal. And I think that what we can recommend is that we examine the ability to calculate that. One of the proposed metrics is the parental income level coming from financial aid data. Our biggest concern right now is most of the public 4 years do not believe that they are allowed by law to share that information because of the Higher Education Act, which would confound the ability to craft it. But we can definitely take a look at whether we can get sufficient information and maybe add that as a data point for consideration by the board. Jeff.
And this relates to your last point, and something Brianna had said about the social mobility, is that Andrew Foote with the PSEO, we chatted with him, and he really feels strongly from their data that first-year earnings are a very, very noisy predictor of 10-year earnings. And it's actually not clear, at least from the brief conversation, that which direction the bias goes. And so you should definitely think about what you're trying to do with it, and then widen or change up when you start looking at that post, or have multiple points where you do a post might also be interesting.
Definitely. So that is the final bullet point. So let's just, would you feel comfortable with the recommendation that the user can set the time horizon for the post wage? So it's not necessarily 1 year, but to Rick's earlier point, it'll be parallel construction between pre and post. Brianna?
Yeah, I just have a general question about that, because when we covered the other definitions, are we allowing for users to see like 10 years out from leaving the institution? Okay, so we are looking at a range of things. Okay,
yeah,
just for this one. Oh.
Yeah, or actually throughout, the idea was that people wanted flexibility to be able to look at earnings trends over time. Just because, I mean, there's so much good data out there about like short-term certificates, how in that first year, you might see a more significant earnings gain for that individual than someone who was getting, say, an associate's degree in anthropology. But if you look at them 10 years out, the certificate, there's no uptick, and there's an exponential increase for, like I like to say, the more classes you take, the more money you make. It's a phenomenon. So yeah.
Yeah, so I also agree with Jeff that 1 year out is difficult to know what's there, and the 2 years is probably a better metric.
Jill?
Yeah, I want to agree that having more time out is a good idea. When you talk, but I have a question about when you talk about parallel construction, we're not talking about like 2 years prior, and then as you get exponentially large, you go 5 years prior, 5 years post. No, it's still
Yeah.
Okay.
But
Yeah.
good clarification. We'll put that.
Okay.
Yeah. Rick?
Yeah, I would just add that for bachelor's graduates, the first year earnings has a lot of noise in it, and I could tell many stories why that's true, but it's just very noisy. So in our public facing site, we start reporting earnings in year 2, and then you get a nice smooth curve up to year 15. But in our power user site, we do include the data for year 1 because it's got some value. But most of the stories that trash the value of higher education in the newspaper, you might notice, use year 1 data.
Absolutely. And then to your point in the chat about using Pell Grant as being a way to identify low income, actually, when we were operationalizing how each segment calculates low income, all the post-secondaries are basically using uptake of financial aid as the proxy to identify that. So if you look at the list of the 200 data points, you'll note that that's expressly stated in that fashion, like receive financial aid, as opposed to saying low income, because there's definitely students who are low income that are not getting financial aid, and therefore you would be misrepresenting the scale of need.
Yeah.
Okay, great. All right, so now we get to living wage attainment. So here we're looking at 3 possible ways to measure it. First of all of these we're looking at using at the MIT Living Wage Calculator because it's a nationally recognized standard. It's showing up in a lot of research reports currently. Many of you actually already use it. And then there's 3 versions. There's the single adults, so 1 adult, no kids. Then there's a family of 4 with 2 working adults, and a family of 4 with 1 working adult, because these really sort of help you understand the degree. And this gets a little bit to Brianna's point about economic mobility. You could see over time whether people are moving from I can only feed myself to my, with help from someone else, I can take care of my family, to something where you really have a lot of space economically. And then the final component of this is because EDD cannot tell us where people are actually employed, because that is not something that employers are required to represent. The location for the individual will be where they were last enrolled in college. So that's the methodology. So your comments back was that it would be valuable to understand other expenses that constrain people's life ability. For example, if they're carrying debt, was one suggestion. And then there was an idea of how do we really operationalize sort of the degree of flexibility that people have in their lives based on categories of expenses. And the concern was it was very difficult to identify what essential items are. Although what I would argue is that MIT has made that judgment on our behalf, because they've said what a living wage is, and in that they have identified what is the cost of living for a set of items. So we'd be sort of adopting their framework. So what are your thoughts looking at this input? Like, should we be amending the proposal about those 3 thresholds for living wage attainment? Jill.
Just a clarifying question actually is, how are we going to calculate, how are we going to, we know that there's the living wage calculator and the way that you're going to operationalize living wage, but how are we actually going to calculate it with having people found 1 quarter, 4 quarters, like sort of that the underlying pieces of how do you assess whether or not someone met a living wage?
That's a really good point. So if we're allowing people to say for everybody is 1 quarter, everybody is 2 quarters, there are going to be relatively few people who would attain that highest echelon with 1 quarter's worth of earnings. So yeah, should we be having a threshold for the number of quarters of data? Jeff?
Yeah, I was just puzzling your question there, because you don't have hours, so you can't convert to an hourly wage, which the living wage calculator also, I think, can do. We've done a bunch of work on creating a good jobs metric, and one of the biggest problems that we have is a minimum standard, and many people think it's too low, and it's based off of using living wage just to kind of rough stuff into place. So just think about that these data come off very low, and so what you do with that in the court of public opinion, you'll figure out, but pre-warned.
Thank you. Brianna?
Yeah, to Jeff's point, I think whatever we do here is, it'll just be worth in the description, just, clarifying what's in there for a living wage, and it is a very basic level and that kind of thing. Yeah, just based on the comments about adding additional stuff, and I get it. Nobody likes my idea of the middle class activities thing, but I do think the student loan repayment though is a piece that I think maybe seriously considered, because we would have that information from the segments that are, giving on the number of loans that students have and what that amount is. So
Actually, they declined.
Oh, they did. Okay. Okay.
Because of the issue with the federal guidance.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. So maybe it doesn't work, but that could be something that also goes in the description. This doesn't take into account student loan repayment that students might need for their living wage or to be able to.
And there is an intention, if we can resolve the concern, that there is a dashboard that's about financial aid, which includes expressly stuff about loans. And so that would be a really good point, again, to look at for an expansion of what gets visualized as we get clarity about those data points. Rick.
I just say, I don't think it makes sense to lower the living wage indicator based on the pattern of employment, because one of the benefits of education is that you're employed more. You have less periods of time when you're laid off. And so the living wage is sort of an absolute benchmark in my mind for the year, and I wouldn't fiddle with that.
So if I were the researcher going on, I'm like, I only want to look at people with 3 quarters worth of data, because I just for clarity, that number came both out of how CSU calculates it, but it's also how the census does for their data set. And so if I was saying, I want to follow what the census does, I'm going to pick 3 quarters, then because that's my cohort, then that means I'm going to be looking at the earnings for people that have 3 or more quarters worth of data, and then how many of those students made it to any of these 3 benchmarks. So does that change how you think about it?
No, because the fact is you have to pay rent and eat for a whole year. And if you only work 3 quarters, you got to generate enough income in 3 quarters to get through the year. I think we would again be accused of stacking the deck to make people look good if we don't take that as a honest benchmark.
Any other thoughts about this approach then? Okay. So then there was a second homework assignment, which was to look at things that we should be taking into consideration when doing testing. And we were asking you to weigh in on 3 different points. So before we finalize the metric definitions, once the metric definitions are finalized and the data have actually been matched, and then when we're updating data, which means that the data will be shifting a little bit because information is going to change about both students and earnings. So this was the result of that homework assignment. So the first is to examine data to see if there are patterns one would expect during recessions. The second would be to compare median earnings to values shown in the U.S. Department of Education's college scorecard. The third was to use the American Community Survey to measure people in a particular age range with positive earnings to evaluate match rates. The fourth was to compare the earnings information to data that comes from places like LinkedIn or that U.S. Census Bureau site. And then finally, the idea that we should be comparing the values to the data provided by each of the segments, understanding methodological differences. So for example, if we know that the Chancellor's Office definition is somehow more generous than UC's definition, and then we're looking at the numbers and we're seeing that they're fitting somewhere between UC and community colleges, then we've got just a sense that we're probably in the right ballpark. So there was that idea, and that you would do that to look at things like salary numbers, looking at match rates based on self-employed students. And this is where we could leverage the data from the CTE outcome survey from community colleges to sort of figure out if we're seeing that reduction in match rates that's about equal to student self-report for self-employment. And also that you'd want to really look at results for specific populations within specific fields of study within, like if we're comparing, say, Cal State Pays and something that's the Cradle-to-Career comes up with, because a lot of that variability, as you may recall, was happening at both the program level and the student characteristic level. This is why I gave that example of an African-American woman making a different amount than a white guy in STEM, because we see a lot of differences there. So because there's that granularity that already exists in many of the segments in your data sets, we could be doing that, looking to figure out where there's more likely to be noise. Because I think the hardest part is when you aggregate all the way up to an entire institution or an entire segment, context really matters. And you can see that in things like the US Department of Education's college scorecard. So you can go in and you can search and say, like, where's the best place to go to school in California? And you end up in a nursing college in Los Angeles because nursing pays and it's expensive to live in LA. So you get those distortions. Anyway, those were the things that came out of the homework assignment. I'm curious about if there's other things related to testing that any of you want to sort of put on the table right now for C2C to think about. Brianna.
I'm sorry if you covered this already. Yeah, so for the example you just gave about differences in outcomes by race and gender, the industry, are we looking at that by industry, or will that be part of the testing? Like,
so we have industry and not occupation. So for those of you that aren't labor market nerds, that means you work in the construction sector, but you could be laying drywall or you could be the CEO. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Because I mean, for us, when we've looked at it by major and by industry of work, and then, you know, the crosstabs of those things, that's really important, right? Because ultimately we're going to be looked at, is it something that the college is doing or something the university is doing, or is it something that the industry is doing, right? And so we want to be able to differentiate that a little bit, especially if we have more students working in certain sectors than others because of whatever their major is or because of whatever their interests are. So I think it's really important to differentiate that if we're going to be making statements about differential earnings as much as we can.
Jeff.
Two quick things. I know you're talking about mostly program completers here, but on some college no degree dropout population, ACS uses less than a year and more than a year, and has created a variable that's inconsistent with the CPS on reporting rates of some college no degree. So you just should be conscious of that, and you can split the variable. And then secondly, if I'm correct, you need to pool the ACS to use it at the state level. And if that's true, you should just, when you do your testing, pool your data so that it matches whatever pool you have to do with the ACS.
Thank you. Jesse.
So I just wanted to raise a question about what nature this takes for each of these kinds of comparisons. I think each of these comparisons is really useful, and it's kind of a research project to kind of dig into it and make the comparison and see what the differences are. But you're never going to get things to be identical. And so then when you do this comparison and things look different but maybe similar, what do we do with that? Is there some threshold that leads you to say, oh, we're not going to publish this series because it doesn't line up with what we had earlier? Or is this something that goes on in the background where you guys do this as part of your due diligence to make sure you have the data right before you go live? I think that would be useful, but I think if you start doing it at the kind of individual program level or major or race by major, you're going to see differences, and I don't know what you make of that. I think if you're confident you've done the data processing right, then I think this is a useful data point to add to our understanding.
I think that we're going to leave that up to the office. We're sort of getting your thoughts about, because one of the things that is the charge of this entity is to be reliable. And given that, you know, earnings are where a lot of people, that's where the news stories are going to go. You know, people really want to know what is college good for, that it would be important to have that. And so any recommendations you have about how to support the staff as they're beginning to look at these numbers would be great. And there'll probably be more opportunities for them to reach out to experts to help them with that process.
Then I guess I would say, if that's what the kind of point of this is, I would recommend not going too deep into thousands of subgroups. That you're going to learn about big issues by looking at the overall means and a couple of kind of gross differences, but if you go into thousands of subgroups, then you're going to find some that are different and have no way of understanding what to make of that. And it doesn't, that's unlikely to alert you to some huge data processing error, which is the point of this exercise.
Thank you. Sandra.
So was any consideration given to looking at this from a regional economy perspective? You know, especially in California, you know, we have such diverse economies within our state. And so when you're looking at, you know, salaries in the Central Valley versus in LA County, like the variety is huge, right? And what is a livable wage in the Central Valley is probably not a livable wage in LA. And so understanding that dynamic and that impact for students is super important when we're looking at these values in terms of, you know, how we compare salaries or whatnot. And always taking the state as a whole is not always a reasonable comparison for programs in specific regions. So just wanted to add that.
That's an excellent point. So one of the things that's helpful to know about the MIT living wage calculator is that it's benchmarked on counties. And so we can, similar to what the Chancellor's Office does in its living wage attainment measure, that you look at the county in which the college is located. So that doesn't take into account the fact that someone may have moved. So maybe I was living in Modesto and then I got some great job in Oakland and it looks like I'm making a living wage because Modesto, it costs less to live than Oakland because housing is the biggest variable. So there will be some wobbles in that, but that does allow us to address some of that. And also, you know, there will be the ability to cut by region if you're trying to understand the data. Brianna.
So I just want to caution again, the comparison of majors and based on earnings if we don't include industry, because we've looked at our data, and if you're a humanities graduate, yes, you make less than a STEM graduate, but if you're a humanities graduate that's working in the tech sector, you make more, you make a lot more. And so the ranking of majors based on how much you make alone, I think, creates a hostile environment towards some majors, which is not what universities are going to want out of this. And we have to draw some attention to industry and what industry is paying for certain sets of skills and that kind of thing as well. But we also have to bring that up because what we were talking about before and looking at different quarters of earnings, like if there's a recession, that's not the university's fault, right? And ultimately this is going to be about the value of the education. So I think if we can include industry here, that would be helpful.
So this is for testing, but one of the things that we can do is make sure that in the construction of how things are shown related to earnings, that industry is taken into account. That's an excellent point. Jeff.
I just wanted to share with people on the living wage. We've done a bunch of work using as an index and taking 35,000. You see it's 22,000 in rural Kentucky and 54,000 in New York City. So hopefully that will give some assurance for people who are worried, rightfully so, about these residential differences. So it's helpful.
Any final thoughts on testing? All right, so I just want to thank you all so much for all of this very thoughtful consideration of a very difficult set of metrics. I know that the Office of Cradle-to-Career is going to be much better off for your expertise. So I'm going to have Sydney close us out.
Yes, thank you so much, Kathy. So for our next steps, the recommendations will be compiled into a single document for review by our task members. And then this document will be shared at our next governing board meeting on August 10th. That meeting is virtual. So I will send out the link via our listserv. And please do not show up in Sacramento because no one will be there. I just want to make that like explicitly clear. And then of course, we would love to have a report out on this task force during that governing board meeting. So do we have any volunteers who are willing to present the work of this task force to our governing board? And again, it is virtual, so it does not require any travel on your part. Do we have any volunteers to to present the work and do a report out? I hear someone unmuted.
I would be willing, but part of my hesitancy is I don't know what we're recommending yet.
Of course, that's fair. That's fair. And I think we can definitely help with creating talking points and kind of help walking you through what to report out to the governing board. So that's something that, that we at C2C in collaboration with WestEd can help to prepare. Do we have any other volunteers?
I guess my questions are, what does this look like? Is it like I don't know, like you said, talking points are, but is there like a presentation, or like what are you envisioning the report out is?
So a report out, it can be a presentation, that's totally fine. Or if you just want to share the work that the task force did up until this point, that'd be great. It would just be like a summary of the work that's been done and the high level discussion points that have been talked about in the last few meetings. Does that kind of help answer the question? Or is it still clear as mud?
I think it'd be helpful, like Richard said, like if we could see like what the summary is at the end of it. I'd be willing to co-participate if there are other people who want to do it as well, but not by myself.
Okay, so far we have Rick Moore and Brianna Moore. How do you pronounce your last name? I want to make sure I don't.
It's more true.
More true. Thank you. So far we have Brianna and Rick. Is there anyone else who would like to present, and we're happy with these two folks as well, but just want to open up the floor if there's anyone else who'd like to co-present with them.
In the spirit of representing all segments, which is interesting, I would be willing to help with that, with all of the caveats that Brianna and Rick have already mentioned.
Thank you, Jill. You were reading my mind. I was sending clues of like, we'd love to have representation from everyone. So thank you. Thank you for picking up those signals.
I'm just a professor, so the chancellor's office will be quick to say I'm not representing the sector.
Well, thank you so much to the three of you. We will be in contact to put together those talking points and to kind of help walk through the presentation. So greatly appreciate it. And that helps that we don't have to volunteer anyone to present. So everyone else is off the hook for now. But thank you so much again for joining us, and to our three presenters for next month's board meeting. We will be in contact. So thank you and enjoy the rest of your afternoon.